The Nevada sun blazed mercilessly over Thunderbird Air Force Base, its heat creating shimmering waves off the concrete flight line, where millions of dollars worth of military aircraft sat in precise formation. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb wiped sweat from his forehead as he crouched beside the landing gear of an F-18 Super Hornet, his weathered hands moving with the practiced precision of 15 years in aircraft maintenance. At 38, Marcus had seen enough broken birds to know when something was seriously wrong. And today's problem had him genuinely puzzled. The multi-million-dollar fighter jet had returned from a routine training mission with engine anomalies that defied every diagnostic test they had run. "Dad, are you almost done?" The small voice belonged to his daughter Emma, who sat cross-legged in the shade of a nearby maintenance truck, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. It was Bring Your Child to Work Day, one of the few times civilian dependents were allowed on the flight line, and Emma had been quietly observing the controlled chaos of military maintenance operations with the intense curiosity that had marked her personality since she could walk. "Give me a few more minutes, sweetheart," Marcus replied, not looking up from the complex array of gauges and readouts that seemed to mock his expertise. "This old bird's got some secrets she's not ready to share yet." Emma nodded and returned to her sketchbook, where she had been drawing detailed pictures of the aircraft around them. To most observers, they would appear to be innocent doodles of a child fascinated by big machines. But a closer look would reveal something extraordinary technical accuracy that bordered on professional, with precise proportions and mechanical details that suggested an understanding far beyond her years. The sound of heavy boots on concrete announced the approach of Master Sergeant Dylan Torres, Marcus's supervisor and a man whose 22 years of service had earned him respect throughout the base. Dylan's expression was grim as he walked up to where Marcus was working, his clipboard thick with maintenance reports and technical manuals. "Any luck with that fuel system anomaly?" Dylan asked, crouching down beside his subordinate. Colonel Stone's been asking questions every 15 minutes, and he's starting to get that look. Marcus sighed and stood up, stretching his back. "I've run every test in the book, Dylan. The fuel flow readings are inconsistent, but all the primary systems check out normal. It's like the jet's trying to tell us something, but we're not speaking the same language." "Well, you better learn fast," Dylan replied. "The colonel wants this bird ready for the demonstration flight tomorrow. We've got some high-ranking visitors coming in from the Pentagon, and he's not about to let a maintenance issue make his squadron look incompetent." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Colonel Chester Stone appeared around the corner of Hangar 7. His pristine uniform reflected his obsession with military perfection. At 45, Stone was a career officer who had climbed the ranks through a combination of political savvy and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. His salt and pepper hair was regulation perfect, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing suggested a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through sheer force of will and authority. Behind him walked Major Eugene Butler, Stone's loyal second-in-command and a man who had built his career on anticipating his superior's needs and echoing his opinions. Butler was younger than Stone by nearly a decade, but his eager to please demeanor and tendency toward sycophancy had earned him the colonel's favor and the quiet contempt of many enlisted personnel. "Sergeant Webb," Stone called out in his commanding voice, the kind that had been honed through years of addressing subordinates who had no choice but to listen. "I trust you have good news about our maintenance situation." Marcus straightened to attention, a response ingrained by years of military discipline. "Sir, we're still working to isolate the source of the fuel system irregularities. The primary diagnostics show." "I don't want to hear about diagnostics," Stone interrupted, his voice carrying the sharp edge of impatience. "I want to hear about solutions. This aircraft needs to be mission ready by 0800 tomorrow, and I'm not going to. Explain to a Pentagon delegation why we can't keep our equipment operational. Emma looked up from her sketchbook, her young eyes taking in the tense interaction between the adults. She had grown up around military personnel and understood the complex hierarchy that governed their interactions. But something about the colonel's tone made her uncomfortable. It reminded her of the bullies at school who used their size and loud voices to intimidate others. "Sir, with respect," Marcus began carefully, "rushing a diagnosis on this type of system could lead to what, Sergeant?" Stone's voice rose slightly, attracting the attention of other maintenance personnel working nearby. "Are you suggesting that my timeline is unrealistic? Are you questioning my understanding of aircraft readiness?" Major Butler stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty. "Colonel, perhaps we should consider bringing in a civilian contractor. Sometimes fresh eyes can spot what we've missed." Stone nodded approvingly at his subordinate's suggestion, while Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The implication was clear. The enlisted maintenance crew was incompetent, unable to handle problems that required real expertise. It was an attitude that had become increasingly common as the military relied more heavily on expensive consultants and outside contractors. "That's exactly the kind of forward thinking I expect from my officers," Stone said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll contact Dr. Richard Hughes from Aerospace Dynamics. He's worked on these systems before, and I'm sure he can identify the problem that has our maintenance team so puzzled." The dismissive tone in Stone's voice when he said "maintenance team" was not lost on anyone present. These were skilled technicians with years of specialized training, men and women, who had dedicated their careers to keeping military aircraft in the sky. But to Stone, they were just glorified mechanics whose limitations required expensive outside intervention. Emma had stopped drawing entirely now, her attention focused on the conversation unfolding before her. Something about the F-18's problem had been nagging at her since she first heard her father describing the symptoms, a familiar pattern that reminded her of stories her mother used to tell about aircraft troubleshooting. Lieutenant Angela Webb had been a brilliant aerospace engineer before her death, and she had filled her daughter's childhood with technical stories and mechanical puzzles that most children would have found boring. But Emma had absorbed every word, every explanation, every insight about how complex systems really worked in the harsh reality of operational conditions. "Dad," Emma said quietly, tugging on her father's uniform sleeve. "The fuel flow problem, does it happen more when the engine's been running for a while?" Marcus glanced down at his daughter, then back at the imposing figure of Colonel Stone. "Not now, sweetheart. The grown-ups are talking about work stuff." But Emma persisted, her voice still soft but insistent. "It's just that Mom used to tell me about jets that had problems with their secondary fuel pumps when they got hot. She said the symptoms looked like primary system failures, but the real problem was—" "That's enough," Stone interrupted sharply. His attention now focused on the small girl who had dared to speak during a serious technical discussion. "This is a military operation, not bring your child to work day at the local barrage. Perhaps Sergeant Webb needs a reminder about appropriate boundaries when it comes to classified maintenance procedures." The word "classified" hung in the air like a threat, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. Having civilian dependents over here. Technical discussions could indeed be problematic, even during official family events, and Stone was clearly looking for any excuse to assert his authority and deflect attention from the maintenance problems that were making his squadron look bad. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as Emma looked up at the colonel with eyes that seemed far older than her 10 years. In that moment, she looked remarkably like her mother, determined, intelligent, and absolutely unintimidated by authority that wasn't backed by competence. Something told her that this was just the beginning of a very long day. "Sir, my daughter was just," Marcus began, but Colonel Stone cut him off with a raised hand. "Your daughter was just demonstrating why children don't belong in operational areas," the colonel said with a cold smile. "Though I suppose it's amusing to hear a 10-year-old girl thinks she can solve problems that have stumped trained technicians. What's next? Are we going to ask the base school children to redesign our avionics systems?" Several of the nearby airmen chuckled nervously, unsure whether they were supposed to find the colonel's sarcasm funny or remain professionally stoic. Major Butler laughed outright, a sound calculated to demonstrate his alignment with his superior's perspective. Emma felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but something deeper than hurt was building in her chest. It was the same feeling she got when teachers dismissed her questions as too advanced for her grade level, or when classmates accused her of showing off because she finished math problems faster than everyone else. But this was different. This wasn't about being smart in school. This was about something her mother had taught her, something connected to the woman whose absence still left an ache in Emma's heart. "I wasn't trying to show off," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the desert air. "I was just thinking about what Mom used to say about secondary fuel pump failures. She said they're really common on F-18s after about 200 flight hours, but most people don't check them because the symptoms look like primary system problems." The laughter died away abruptly. Stone's expression shifted from amused condescension to something darker, a mixture of irritation and disbelief that a child, the daughter of an enlisted man no less, would dare to continue speaking after being dismissed. Around them, the normal sounds of the flight line seemed to fade as maintenance personnel stopped their work to witness what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation. "Your mother," Stone said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, was probably repeating something she heard from real engineers. "But this is the real world, little girl, not a bedtime story. These aircraft represent millions of dollars of taxpayer investment, and their maintenance requires genuine expertise, not fairy tales from someone's mommy." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Major Butler looked uncomfortable with the harshness of his superior's words. Several of the enlisted personnel exchanged glances, recognizing that something important was happening, but unsure how to respond. Master Sergeant Torres stepped forward slightly, his voice careful but firm. "Sir, if I may, Mrs. Webb was actually Lieutenant Angela Webb, one of the lead aerospace engineers on the F-18 secondary systems project before her deployment. She died in Afghanistan while working on classified modifications to improve fuel efficiency in extreme conditions." Stone's face flushed slightly, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "I don't care if she was Amelia Earhart herself," he snapped. "A 10-year-old girl doesn't diagnose multi-million-dollar aircraft, and I won't have my maintenance schedule derailed by some child's half-remembered stories." But Emma wasn't listening anymore. The mention of her mother's work had triggered a flood of memories, late evenings when Angela would come home from the base and talk excitedly about fuel system innovations. Weekend sessions where mother and daughter would build model aircraft while discussing the physics of flight, and quiet moments when Angela would explain complex engineering concepts in ways that made perfect sense to her curious daughter. "The secondary fuel pump," Emma said, her voice stronger now, carrying the confidence that came from certain knowledge. "It's not supposed to run continuously during extended flight operations. When it does, it creates back pressure that makes the primary system readings look normal, even when fuel flow is actually decreased. Mom said you have to check the pump's duty cycle, not just its output pressure." Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry, who had been working quietly on a nearby aircraft, looked up sharply. Wayne was one of the most experienced mechanics on the base, a man whose 30 years of service had given him an almost intuitive understanding of aircraft systems. Something in Emma's words had triggered a recognition, a piece of the puzzle that he had been missing. Duty cycle, Wayne muttered to himself, then louder. The kid might be onto something. We've been checking output pressure and flow rates, but we haven't looked at the pump's operational frequency. If it's running outside normal parameters, that's enough, Stone barked, his authority clearly threatened by the possibility that a child might have identified something his trained personnel had missed. I will not have my maintenance operations guided by the imaginative stories of a 10-year-old. Sergeant Webb, remove your daughter from this area immediately and report to my office at 1500 hours for a discussion about appropriate conduct during family day activities. The threat was unmistakable. Marcus could face disciplinary action, possibly even a formal reprimand that would damage his career, all because his daughter had dared to offer a suggestion that the colonel found personally insulting. The injustice of it burned in his chest. But 15 years of military service had taught him the dangers of challenging superior officers in public. As Marcus reached for his daughter's hand, preparing to lead her away from what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation, Emma looked up at Colonel Stone with eyes that seemed far older than her 10 years. In that moment, she looked remarkably like her mother, determined, intelligent, and absolutely unintimidated by authority that wasn't backed by competence. My mom died trying to make aircraft safer, she said quietly, her words carrying across the flight line with unexpected power. She would have wanted someone to check the secondary fuel pump. The simple dignity of her statement hit everyone present like a physical blow. Here was a child defending her mother's memory and her mother's work, standing up to a full colonel with nothing but truth and courage. Around them, the maintenance crew stood frozen, witnesses to a moment that would be remembered and discussed long after the day's work was finished. Colonel Stone's face had gone from red to white, his jaw working silently as he struggled between his wounded pride and the growing realization that he had badly miscalculated the situation. Major Butler stood beside him like a statue, clearly recognizing that any support he offered now would likely make things worse. And in the growing silence, Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry was already walking toward the F-18, his toolbox in hand and a look of grim determination on his weathered face. Because sometimes, in the military as in life, the truth had a way of asserting itself regardless of rank or protocol. The real test was just beginning. Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry's toolbox clanged against the concrete as he set it down beside the F-18's access panel. His movements were deliberate, each action carrying the weight of 3 decades spent coaxing secrets from stubborn aircraft. The other maintenance personnel watched with growing interest as Wayne ignored the tension crackling between Colonel Stone and the Webb family, focusing instead on the mechanical mystery that had consumed their morning. "Wayne, what do you think?" "You doing?" Master Sergeant Torres asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Wayne's grizzled face split into a grim smile as he selected a specialized diagnostic tool from his kit. "Following a lead, Dylan. Sometimes the best troubleshooting advice comes from the most unexpected places." He glanced meaningfully toward Emma, who was still standing beside her father with quiet determination etched across her young features. Colonel Stone stepped forward, his voice cutting through the desert air like a blade. "Sergeant Perry, I gave explicit orders about how this maintenance issue would be handled. We are bringing in Dr. Hughes to resolve this situation professionally." "With respect, sir," Wayne replied without looking up from the access panel he was opening. "Dr. Hughes won't be here until tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, we've got a bird that needs to fly, and checking a secondary fuel pump duty cycle takes about 10 minutes. Seems like reasonable troubleshooting to me." The challenge in Wayne's words was subtle but unmistakable. He was using the colonel's own urgency against him, suggesting that traditional military efficiency demanded investigating all possible solutions rather than waiting for expensive consultants. It was a masterful piece of tactical insubordination, delivered with just enough professional courtesy to make disciplinary action difficult. Major Buckler sensed his superior's growing frustration and stepped forward to provide support. "Sergeant Perry, surely you understand that maintenance procedures must follow established protocols. We can't have every airman pursuing random theories. Based on ... double quotes. Based on what, sir?" Wayne's voice carried a dangerous edge as he finally looked up from his work. "Based on the technical knowledge of a decorated Air Force engineer who died serving her country. Based on the possibility that a 10-year-old girl might understand aircraft systems better than some of us want to admit." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, other maintenance personnel had stopped pretending to work on their own assignments, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a senior NCO directly challenging officer authority. This wasn't just about aircraft maintenance anymore. It was about respect, competence, and the military's complex relationship with expertise that didn't come wrapped in the right uniform or rank structure. Captain Rebecca Walsh appeared at the edge of the group, her flight suit marking her as one of the pilots who would eventually take these aircraft into the sky. At 28, Rebecca had earned her wings through exceptional skill and determination, fighting against both subtle and overt bias in a profession still dominated by men. She understood better than most what it meant to have your competence questioned based on factors beyond your control. "Is there a problem here?" Rebecca asked, her eyes taking in the tense scene with the practiced assessment of someone trained to evaluate complex situations quickly. Colonel Stone turned toward her, clearly relieved to have another officer present who might support his position. "Captain Walsh, we're dealing with some irregular maintenance procedures. Sergeant Perry seems to think that diagnostic protocols can be determined by..." He paused, searching for words that would express his disdain without sounding completely unreasonable. "Unconventional sources." Rebecca's gaze shifted to Wayne, who was now connecting diagnostic equipment to the F-18's secondary fuel system. She had flown enough missions to recognize the sound of competent maintenance work, and Wayne's movements carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "What kind of unconventional sources?" she asked carefully. Before anyone could answer, Wayne's diagnostic equipment began displaying data on its small screen. The veteran mechanic studied the readouts with growing excitement, his weathered features lighting up with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally yielding its secrets. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, then caught himself and glanced apologetically toward Emma. "Sorry, kid, but you were absolutely right. The secondary fuel pump is running at nearly twice its normal duty cycle. It's been compensating for a failing primary regulator, which is why all our primary system diagnostics look normal." The silence that followed was profound. Technical Sergeant Perry had just confirmed that a 10-year-old girl had correctly diagnosed a problem that had stumped a team of experienced aircraft mechanics. More importantly, she had done it using knowledge inherited from her mother, a woman whose expertise Colonel Stone had dismissed as bedtime stories. Master Sergeant Torres moved closer to examine Wayne's diagnostic equipment, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as he reviewed the data. "Wayne, if the secondary pump fails while compensating for the primary regulator, we'd have complete fuel system failure during flight." "That's exactly right," Wayne replied grimly. This bird was maybe 6 flight hours away from a catastrophic engine failure. If we'd sent her up tomorrow for the demonstration flight. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone present understood the implications. A fuel system failure during a high-profile demonstration would have been more than embarrassing. It could have been deadly. The F-18 would have been carrying a pilot, possibly with Pentagon observers aboard, overpopulated areas where an emergency landing might not be possible. Captain Walsh felt her stomach tighten as she considered how close they had come to disaster. "How long has this condition existed?" she asked. Wayne consulted his diagnostic equipment again. "Based on these wear patterns, I'd say at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. The primary regulator's been failing gradually, and the secondary pumps been working overtime to maintain normal fuel flow. It's actually pretty sophisticated compensatory behavior the aircraft's been trying to keep itself airworthy, despite a deteriorating component." 2 weeks, Rebecca repeated softly. "I've flown this aircraft 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Every one of those flights could have ended in catastrophic failure." The weight of that realization settled over the group like a physical presence. This wasn't just about maintenance procedures or military hierarchy anymore. It was about life and death, about the difference between competent troubleshooting and dangerous pride. Emma had remained quiet during Wayne's diagnostic work, but now she stepped forward slightly, her young voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Mom always said that aircraft try to tell you when something's wrong. You just have to know how to listen." Colonel Stone's face had gone through several color changes during Wayne's diagnosis, from skeptical red to embarrassed white to a flush of anger that suggested he was preparing to reassert his authority, despite the evidence. But Emma's simple statement seemed to deflate something in him, replacing bluster with the uncomfortable recognition that he had been fundamentally wrong. "The maintenance records," he said finally, his voice lacking its earlier commanding edge. "Why didn't our regular inspections catch this?" Wayne and Torres exchanged glances, both men recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. Questioning maintenance procedures was one thing, but implying systematic failures in the Colonel's squadron was quite another. "Sir," Torres began carefully, "the secondary fuel pump isn't part of standard pre-flight diagnostics. It's typically checked during major overhauls every few hundred flight hours." The compensatory behavior Wayne described would have masked the symptoms during routine inspections. "So you're telling me," Stone said slowly, "that our maintenance protocols have a blind spot that could have resulted in aircraft loss and pilot death?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Everyone present understood that this was no longer just about today's maintenance problem. It was about systemic issues that reached far beyond Thunderbird Air Force Base. If secondary fuel pump failures could mask themselves as normal operation, how many other aircraft might be flying with similar hidden problems? As the implications of Emma's discovery continued to sink in, none of them noticed the black sedan that had just pulled into the base's visitor parking area, or the woman with Pentagon credentials who was photographing their interaction from a distance. The story was about to become much larger than anyone realized. Dr. Richard Hughes emerged from his expensive rental car with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to making dramatic entrances. His tailored civilian suit stood out starkly against the utilitarian military environment, and his leather briefcase bore the kind of expensive hardware that suggested both success and self-importance. At 52, Hughes had built a lucrative consulting empire by positioning himself as the expert who could solve problems that stumped military personnel. "Colonel Stone," Hughes called out, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who expected immediate attention. "I apologize for arriving ahead of schedule, but I received your urgent message about the F-18 fuel system irregularities and flew out immediately." Stone turned toward the approaching consultant, his expression shifting through multiple emotions as he processed the awkward timing of Hughes's arrival. Just minutes earlier, he had been preparing to rely on this man's expertise to solve a problem that had now been diagnosed by a 10-year-old girl. The irony was not lost on him, and neither was the potential embarrassment of explaining the situation. "Dr. Hughes," Stone replied, forcing professionalism into his voice. "Thank you for responding so quickly. However, It appears that we've resolved the immediate diagnostic issue. Hughes's eyebrows rose in surprise, and his gaze swept across the maintenance personnel who were still gathered around the F-18. His eyes lingered on Wayne, Perry's diagnostic equipment, and the satisfied expressions of the mechanics who had just witnessed their colleague's vindication. Resolved? Hughes repeated, setting down his briefcase with careful deliberation. I must say, Colonel, that's quite remarkable. When we spoke yesterday, you indicated that your maintenance team had exhausted all conventional diagnostic approaches. What breakthrough occurred in the last 18 hours? The question was phrased politely, but its implications were clear. Hughes was suggesting that either the problem hadn't been as complex as originally indicated, or that the military's initial assessment had been incompetent. Either way, it cast doubt on the need for his expensive services. Master Sergeant Torres stepped forward, recognizing that his colonel was in a difficult position. Dr. Hughes, we identified a secondary fuel pump failure that was masking itself as normal primary system operation. The diagnostic approach came from some unconventional technical consultation. Unconventional? Hughes's professional smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he surveyed the group. I'm always interested in innovative diagnostic methodologies. Which consulting firm provided this breakthrough analysis? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken complexity. Around them, the normal sounds of base operations continued, the distant whine of aircraft engines, the rumble of ground support vehicles, the sharp commands of drill instructors working with trainees. But in their small circle, the tension was palpable as everyone recognized the delicate nature of the situation. Emma had been standing quietly beside her father, observing the interaction with the keen attention that marked her approach to understanding adult behavior. Something about Dr. Hughes struck her as familiar, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was his assumption of authority, or the way he seemed to expect deference from people who clearly knew more about aircraft than he did. The consultation came from someone with extensive experience in F-18 secondary fuel systems, Captain Walsh said diplomatically. Someone who understood the failure modes that aren't covered in standard diagnostic protocols. Hughes nodded approvingly, clearly interpreting this as validation of his belief that complex problems required specialized expertise. Excellent. I'd like to review their analysis and discuss how we might incorporate their methodology into future maintenance protocols. Which firm are we talking about? Lockheed's consulting division? Boeing's military support team? Actually, Wayne Perry interjected, his weathered face showing the hint of a smile. Our consultant is right here. Hughes followed Wayne's gaze toward the group of maintenance personnel, his eyes scanning past Master Sergeant Torres, Technical Sergeant Perry, and Staff Sergeant Webb before settling on Captain Walsh. His expression brightened with the recognition that he was dealing with a fellow professional. Captain Walsh, I presume? I should have recognized the pilot's perspective in the diagnostic approach. Your flight experience obviously provided insights that ground-based maintenance personnel might miss. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the assumption underlying Hughes's words. He had automatically credited her with Emma's insight, not because of any evidence, but because she was the only person present who fit his expectations of who could possess advanced technical knowledge. Dr. Hughes, she said carefully, I think there's been a misunderstanding about who. There's no misunderstanding, Emma interrupted, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. You think Captain Walsh figured out the fuel pump problem because she's a pilot and an officer, but she didn't. I did. Hughes's attention shifted to the small girl with the kind of indulgent expression adults typically reserve for children who had inserted themselves into grown-up conversations. His smile was patronizing, the sort that suggested he found her interruption charming but irrelevant. That's very sweet, young lady. he said in the tone typically used for precocious children at family gatherings. "I'm sure you've been paying close attention to all the technical discussions. It's wonderful when children show interest in aviation." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and it triggered something in Emma that went beyond simple annoyance. This was the same attitude she had encountered from Colonel Stone, the same automatic dismissal that suggested her age and appearance made her contributions impossible rather than just unexpected. "I'm not being sweet," Emma replied, her voice steady and serious. "I'm telling you what happened. The F-18 had a secondary fuel pump running at excessive duty cycle to compensate for primary regulator failure. The symptoms looked like normal operation because the secondary system was masking the primary system degradation. My mother taught me about this failure mode when I was 7 years old." Hughes's expression shifted from indulgent amusement to confusion, then to something approaching irritation. He was clearly struggling to process a situation that didn't fit his professional worldview, a child claiming technical expertise in advanced aerospace systems. "Your mother," he repeated slowly, "taught you about F-18 fuel system failure modes when you were 7. "Yes," Emma replied simply. She was Lieutenant Angela Webb. She designed the secondary fuel system modifications that were implemented fleet-wide in 2019. She died in Afghanistan while working on classified improvements to extreme weather fuel efficiency. The weight of that revelation settled over the group like a physical presence. Hughes's confident demeanor faltered as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. Angela Webb's name was well known in aerospace engineering circles. Her fuel system innovations had saved the military millions of dollars and potentially countless lives. Dr. Hughes opened his briefcase and retrieved a tablet, his fingers moving quickly across its surface as he accessed technical databases. After several moments of intense concentration, he looked up with an expression that had shifted from condescension to genuine shock. "Lieutenant Angela Webb," he said slowly, "published 17 peer-reviewed papers on military aircraft fuel systems. Her secondary pump efficiency modifications are considered standard reference material in aerospace engineering programs. She held 3 patents on fuel flow optimization and was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for innovations that improved aircraft safety across multiple platforms." "That's right," Marcus said quietly, pride and pain mingling in his voice. "And she spent every evening for 10 years teaching our daughter everything she knew about how aircraft actually work, not just how they're supposed to work according to manuals." Hughes stared at Emma with the expression of a man whose fundamental assumptions about expertise and authority had just been challenged in the most unexpected way possible. Here was a 10-year-old girl who had inherited knowledge from one of the most respected aerospace engineers of her generation, and she had just demonstrated that inheritance by solving a problem that had stumped both military maintenance personnel and necessitated expensive consulting services. "You actually diagnosed the secondary fuel pump failure," Hughes said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. A 10-year-old girl identified a systemic maintenance blind spot that could have resulted in catastrophic aircraft loss. "It wasn't that hard," Emma replied with the straightforward honesty that marked all her interactions. "Mom always said, that aircraft tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen." The symptoms were pretty obvious once you understood what the secondary pump was trying to compensate for. Colonel Stone had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing that his earlier dismissal of Emma was looking increasingly problematic. The presence of Dr. Hughes, a man whose reputation and fees were built on solving exactly these kinds of complex technical problems, made the situation even more delicate. "Dr. Hughes," Stone said, attempting to regain control of the narrative, "while we appreciate Miss Webb's contribution to the diagnostic process, I think we should focus on implementing proper maintenance protocols to prevent future occurrences of this type of failure. But Hughes wasn't listening. His attention remained focused on Emma as he struggled to process the reality of being intellectually outmaneuvered by someone who wasn't even old enough to have a driver's license. "Miss Webb," he said carefully, "the diagnostic approach you used, checking secondary pump duty cycles during primary system evaluation, that's not standard protocol in any maintenance manual I'm familiar with. How did you know to look for that? Specific failure mode?" Emma's expression brightened with the enthusiasm that always marked her discussions of technical subjects. "Because that's how the systems actually interact, not how they're designed to work on paper. Mom said that most maintenance problems happen at the interfaces between systems, especially when one system tries to compensate for another system's failure. She taught me to always look for what's working too hard when everything else looks normal." The elegance of that diagnostic philosophy was immediately apparent to everyone present. It represented exactly the kind of intuitive understanding that separated truly skilled technicians from those who simply followed procedures. And it had just been articulated by a child whose formal education hadn't yet progressed beyond elementary mathematics. As the magnitude of Emma's achievement continued to sink in, none of them noticed the woman with Pentagon credentials who had been photographing their interaction from the parking area, or the encrypted phone call she was now making to superiors whose interest in exceptional children extended far beyond aircraft maintenance. The situation was about to become much more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Hughes closed his tablet and looked around at the group with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his entire professional worldview. "Miss Webb, would you be willing to review some other diagnostic challenges we've been working on? I have several cases where conventional approaches have failed to identify root causes." Before Emma could respond, Colonel Stone stepped forward with barely contained alarm. "Dr. Hughes, I hardly think it's appropriate to involve a 10-year-old child in classified maintenance issues. There are security protocols, clearance requirements, professional standards, all of which," Hughes interrupted quietly, "seem considerably less important than preventing aircraft loss and pilot death. Miss Webb has just demonstrated diagnostic capabilities that exceed those of most aerospace engineers I work with. Her mother's knowledge, combined with her obvious natural aptitude, represents a resource that frankly makes my services redundant." The admission hung in the air like a challenge to everything Colonel Stone believed about military hierarchy, professional credentials, and the proper order of things. Here was an expensive consultant essentially arguing that a 10-year-old girl was more valuable than his own expertise, and doing so in front of enlisted personnel who had already witnessed their commanding officer's earlier dismissal of that same child. "What I think we need," Stone said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "is a more systematic approach to this situation. Dr. Hughes, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we need to follow proper channels for any technical consultation involving classified systems." The black sedan that had been parked in the visitor area was now approaching the maintenance line, its government plates and tinted windows marking it as official business. As it came to a stop near the group, Emma felt a strange chill despite the desert heat. Something about the car's occupants, even before she could see them clearly, triggered the same protective instincts that had kept her quiet during too many adult conversations about her mother's death. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Reynolds emerged from the passenger seat, a Navy uniform and Pentagon identification, marking her as someone whose interest in Air Force maintenance issues suggested complications far beyond routine base operations. Behind her, Dr. Linda Garrett stepped out with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, director of the Defense Innovation Initiative, a woman who had built her reputation by identifying and exploiting exceptional capabilities that could transform military operations. Colonel Stone, Reynolds called out as she approached, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I'm Lieutenant Commander Reynolds from the Pentagon's Aircraft Safety Review Board. We need to discuss your squadron's maintenance anomalies immediately. Stone felt his throat constrict as he processed the implications of a Pentagon safety investigation arriving at his base without advance notice. Safety review boards were typically deployed only when serious problems had been identified through other channels, and their presence suggested that today's fuel pump discoveries were part of a larger pattern that had attracted high-level attention. Commander Reynolds, Stone replied, forcing professionalism into his voice despite his growing alarm. I wasn't aware that the Pentagon had been notified of our maintenance situation. Reynolds' expression suggested that there was a great deal Colonel Stone wasn't aware of, and that his ignorance was itself part of the problem she had been sent to investigate. Colonel, we've been monitoring maintenance anomalies across multiple F-18 squadrons for the past 6 months. Your base shows patterns that suggest systemic issues requiring immediate federal oversight. She paused, her attention shifting to the group of maintenance personnel and civilians who were still gathered around the diagnostic equipment. Her gaze lingered on Dr. Hughes, whose presence as an outside consultant clearly fitted into whatever investigation had brought her to Thunderbird. I understand, Reynolds continued, that significant maintenance discoveries were made here today through unconventional diagnostic approaches. I need to speak with everyone involved in those discoveries, starting with whoever identified the secondary fuel pump failure that prompted your emergency squadron inspections. The moment hung suspended as everyone present recognized that Emma Webb was about to become the center of a Pentagon investigation. The small girl who had simply wanted to help her father with an aircraft problem was now standing at the intersection of military safety protocols, federal oversight, and questions that reached far beyond Thunderbird Air Force Base. Dr. Garrett stepped forward, her tablet already displaying files that suggested she had been researching the Webb family long before arriving at the base. Colonel Stone, our records indicate that the diagnostic breakthrough came from Miss Emma Webb, daughter of Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and the late Lieutenant Angela Webb. Is that correct? Stone's face paled as he realized that these people knew more about his personnel than he did, and that Emma's family background had attracted attention from defense research programs, whose interest in exceptional children was becoming uncomfortably clear. Yes, ma'am, Emma said, stepping forward with the same quiet dignity that had marked her behavior throughout the day's extraordinary events. I'm the one who identified the fuel pump problem. My name is Emma Webb, and my mother taught me how aircraft systems work together. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds stared down at the 10-year-old girl with an expression that suggested she was processing information that didn't fit any of her expectations about Pentagon investigations, military hierarchies, or the kinds of people who solved complex aerospace engineering problems. Miss Webb, Reynolds said, crouching down to bring herself closer to Emma's level, I need you to understand that what we're discussing here involves aircraft safety issues that could affect military operations nationwide. Are you comfortable answering some questions about how you identified the fuel pump problem? Emma nodded solemnly, her young face reflecting an understanding that this was no longer just about helping her father with his work. Yes, ma'am, but I should tell you that I didn't really discover anything new. Mom's research papers already explained how secondary fuel pumps compensate for primary system failures. I just remembered what she taught me. Reynolds exchanged glances with Dr. Garrett, both women clearly recognizing the implications of what they were hearing. The suggestion that Angela Webb's published research contained insights relevant to current fleet-wide maintenance issues was significant in ways that extended far beyond today's events. Miss Webb, Reynolds asked carefully, When you mentioned your mother's research, are you referring to Lieutenant Angela Webb's work on fuel system optimization? Yes, ma'am. She published a lot of papers about how fuel systems actually behave in real flight conditions, not just how they're supposed to work according to design specifications. She said that most maintenance problems happen because people treat aircraft like they're built the way the manuals say they're built, instead of how they actually operate after thousands of flight hours. Dr. Hughes stepped forward, his tablet displaying technical documents that he had been reviewing since Emma's earlier explanation. Commander Reynolds, I've been examining Lieutenant Webb's published research since this morning. Her 2018 paper on secondary fuel pump stress patterns specifically warned about the failure modes we've discovered today. The diagnostic approach Miss Webb used is described in detail in her mother's work. Reynolds accepted Hughes's tablet and spent several minutes reviewing the technical documentation, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she processed the implications of what she was reading. Around them, the maintenance personnel waited in tense silence, recognizing that they were witnessing the intersection of military investigation, technical expertise, and family legacy in ways that none of them had anticipated. Dr. Hughes, Reynolds said finally, are you telling me that Lieutenant Webb's research predicted exactly the type of maintenance failures we're seeing across multiple F-18 squadrons? More than predicted, Hughes replied grimly. Her research specifically recommended diagnostic protocols that would have identified these problems before they became safety hazards. She outlined maintenance procedures that could prevent the accelerated component wear we've documented at Thunderbird and other bases. Colonel Stone felt his stomach drop as he processed the implications of Hughes's statement. If Angela Webb's research had provided solutions to problems that were now threatening his career and his pilot's safety, it meant that those solutions had been available for years but had never been implemented through proper channels. Commander Reynolds, Stone interjected, his voice tight with growing desperation. I want to be clear that my maintenance personnel have followed all established protocols. We've adhered to every regulation and procedure outlined in current technical orders. Reynolds' expression suggested that following established protocols might actually be part of the problem rather than evidence of competence. Colonel Stone, that's exactly what concerns us. If multiple squadrons are experiencing identical failure patterns while following identical procedures, it suggests that the procedures themselves may be inadequate. Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to voice concerns that have been building throughout his career. Ma'am, if I may, a lot of us in maintenance have noticed that the official technical orders don't always reflect what actually works in the field. Sometimes the real expertise comes from people like Lieutenant Webb, who understood the gap between design theory and operational reality. Explain what you mean by that, Sergeant Perry, Reynolds requested, her tone indicating genuine interest in insights from experienced maintenance personnel. Wayne glanced nervously at Colonel Stone, recognizing that his next words could have serious implications for everyone present. Ma'am, the technical orders are written by engineers who understand how aircraft are supposed to work. But Lieutenant Webb was one of the few people who studied how they actually work after years of operational stress. Her research showed that real-world conditions create failure modes that don't exist in laboratory testing. Reynolds nodded slowly, clearly processing Wayne's explanation in the context of larger patterns she had been investigating. Sergeant Perry, are you saying that current maintenance protocols are based on theoretical performance rather than actual operational data? That's exactly what I'm saying, ma'am. And that's why what happened here today is so important. Miss Webb used her mother's real-world research to identify a problem that standard protocols missed completely. Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense concentration that marked her approach to understanding complex situations. Something about the discussion was triggering memories of conversations with her. Mother late evening talks about the frustrations Angela had experienced trying to get her research implemented through official channels. Mom used to say that the hardest part of her job wasn't figuring out how to fix aircraft problems. Emma said quietly, her words carrying clearly in the desert air. The hardest part was getting people to listen when she told them how to prevent problems before they happened. The simple statement hit the assembled group with uncomfortable force. Here was a child articulating the fundamental challenge that had plagued Angela Webb's career and was now manifesting as fleet-wide safety issues that could have been prevented years earlier. Dr. Garrett had been taking notes throughout the conversation, but now she closed her tablet and looked around at the group with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering her entire approach to the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said formally, "what we've discovered here today represents both a crisis and an opportunity. Miss Webb has demonstrated that innovative diagnostic approaches can identify safety issues that standard protocols miss. Her mother's research appears to contain solutions to problems we're still struggling to understand." She paused, her gaze settling on Emma with something approaching reverence. "Miss Webb, I'm going to ask something that may seem overwhelming for someone your age. Would you be willing to work with our technical teams to review current maintenance protocols and identify other areas where your mother's research might prevent future safety issues?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge to everything anyone thought they knew about military expertise, age restrictions, and the appropriate channels for technical consultation. Dr. Garrett was essentially offering a 10-year-old girl a consulting role in fleet-wide safety analysis, based on nothing more than demonstrated competence and inherited knowledge. Marcus felt his protective instincts flaring as he processed the implications of what these people were asking of his daughter. The opportunities they were describing sounded impressive, but they came with obligations and institutional control that could fundamentally alter Emma's childhood. "Dr. Garrett," he said carefully, "I appreciate the opportunities you're describing, but my primary concern is Emma's well-being. She's been through a lot today, and I need to understand exactly what kind of participation you're envisioning." Before Garrett could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention toward the base's main entrance. 3 black SUVs were moving across the tarmac with the kind of purposeful speed that suggested official business of the highest priority. The vehicle's government plates and escort markings indicated that someone very important was about to join their already complicated situation. Emma looked around at the adults surrounding her father's protective concern, Lieutenant Commander Reynolds' official authority, Dr. Hughes's professional acknowledgement of her capabilities, and Colonel Stone's complex mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. The weight of their expectations was enormous, but so was the memory of her mother's dedication to keeping pilots safe. "I want to help," she said quietly, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her throughout the day's challenges. "If Mom's research can help keep pilots safe, then I want to help make sure people understand it. But I also want to stay with my dad and go to regular school with my friends." As the convoy of SUVs drew closer, none of them realized that Emma's simple request for a normal life while contributing her extraordinary knowledge would prove to be more challenging than solving any aircraft maintenance problem. The forces converging on Thunderbird Air Force Base had plans that extended far beyond family preferences, and the next phase of Emma's incredible day would test whether love and military honor could protect her from those who saw her gifts as bestiaires, resources to be controlled rather than abilities to be nurtured. The real battle was just beginning. General Beverly Hunt stepped out of the lead SUV with the commanding presence that had defined her 30-year military career. At 58, she was one of the few women to achieve general officer rank in the Air Force, and her reputation for operational excellence was matched only by her fierce protection of the personnel under her command. Behind her, Admiral James Foster emerged with the measured authority of someone whose decisions affected military policy at the highest levels, followed by a small team of Pentagon officials whose presence suggested that Emma's morning diagnosis had attracted attention from the most senior levels of defense leadership. "Colonel Stone," General Hunt called out as she approached, a voice carrying across the maintenance area with unmistakable command authority. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports about the fuel system failures at Thunderbird. What I need now is a direct briefing from the individual who identified the diagnostic approach that revealed these fleet-wide safety issues." Stone straightened. To rigid attention, his earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of general officer scrutiny. "General Hunt, the diagnostic breakthrough came from Miss Emma Webb, daughter of Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and the late Lieutenant Angela Webb. She identified secondary fuel pump failure that initiated today's emergency squadron inspections." Hunt's penetrating gaze focused on Emma through the desert heat, her expression shifting through what appeared to be genuine surprise as she processed the reality of conducting a technical briefing with a 10-year-old child. The general's reputation for directness and intolerance of inefficiency was legendary, but she was clearly struggling to reconcile her expectations with the situation presented before her. "Miss Webb," Hunt said, her tone reflecting an attempt to balance military formality with age-appropriate communication, "I understand that you identified a maintenance issue that our trained technicians had missed. Can you explain how you diagnosed the fuel pump problem?" Emma straightened slightly, responding to the general's authority with the respect that had been ingrained through years of military family life. "Yes, ma'am. The F-18 was showing inconsistent fuel flow readings, but all the primary system diagnostics looked normal. That pattern reminded me of something Mom taught me about secondary fuel pumps working too hard to compensate for primary system failures." "Your mother taught you about F-18 fuel system interactions," Hunt repeated slowly, clearly processing the implications of inherited technical knowledge from a decorated aerospace engineer. "Miss Webb, the diagnostic approach you use checking secondary pump duty cycles, that's not standard protocol in current maintenance procedures." "No, ma'am," Emma replied with straightforward honesty. "Mom said that standard procedures were written for how aircraft are supposed to work, but she studied how they actually work after thousands of flight hours in real operational conditions. She said the difference between those two things was where most safety problems started." The elegance of that observation resonated through the assembled group with uncomfortable clarity. Here was a child articulating the fundamental disconnect between theoretical maintenance protocols and operational reality, a gap that had apparently contributed to fleet-wide safety issues that were now requiring Pentagon-level investigation. Admiral Foster stepped forward, his expression reflecting both professional respect and something approaching awe. "Miss Webb, when you observed the fuel flow inconsistencies, what specifically made you think about secondary pump compensation?" Emma's expression brightened with the enthusiasm that always marked her discussions of technical subjects. "Because that's how systems protect themselves, sir. When one component starts failing, other components work harder to maintain normal operation. Mom taught me that aircraft are like living things. They try to keep themselves working even when they're hurt. But if you don't notice what's working too hard, eventually everything breaks." The profound simplicity of that explanation hit everyone present with immediate recognition. Emma had just described complex systems analysis in terms that were both technically accurate and intuitively accessible, demonstrating an understanding of aircraft behavior that transcended formal engineering education. Dr. Hughes, who had been granted permission to observe the briefing, stepped forward with his tablet displaying technical documentation. "General Hunt, if I may add context, Miss Webb's diagnostic philosophy is directly derived from her mother's published research on compensatory system behavior in military aircraft. Lieutenant Webb's work specifically identified the failure modes we discovered today. Hunt's expression grew increasingly troubled as she processed the implications of Hughes's statement. Dr. Hughes, are you telling me that Lieutenant Webb's research contains solutions to the maintenance problems we're currently investigating? More than solutions. General. Her research outlined preventive maintenance protocols that would have identified these issues before they became safety hazards. The secondary fuel pump stress patterns we've documented across multiple F-18 squadrons were specifically predicted in her 2018 paper on operational versus theoretical system performance. General Hunt spent several moments in contemplative silence, her experienced mind processing the institutional implications of what she was hearing. If Angela Webb's research had provided early warnings about fleet-wide safety issues that were only now being discovered through emergency inspections, it suggested systematic failures that reached far beyond individual base operations. "Commander." "Reynolds," Hunt said grimly, "I want a complete review of Lieutenant Webb's published research and an analysis of why her recommendations weren't incorporated into standard maintenance protocols. If we've been ignoring safety improvements for years while experiencing the exact problems she predicted, that represents a systemic failure that requires immediate correction." Colonel Stone, who had been standing silently throughout the briefing, felt his career prospects collapsing as he recognized the scope of the investigation that was unfolding. The suggestion that his squadron's maintenance problems were part of a larger pattern of institutional neglect made his earlier dismissal of Emma's insights look increasingly like dangerous incompetence. "General Hunt," Stone interjected, his voice carrying barely controlled desperation, "I want to emphasize that my personnel followed all established maintenance protocols. We adhered strictly to current technical orders and regulatory guidance." Hunt's gaze shifted to Stone with an expression that suggested his adherence to inadequate protocols was itself part of the problem she was investigating. "Colonel Stone, following inadequate procedures is not a defense. It's evidence of failure to maintain operational awareness. If your maintenance protocols were insufficient to prevent fleet-wide safety issues, then your responsibility was to identify those inadequacies and request updated guidance." The rebuke was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that marked Hunt's approach to leadership failures, and its implications were clear to everyone present. Stone's career was now directly tied to questions about his competence to recognize and respond to systemic maintenance problems that had endangered pilots and aircraft under his command. Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with growing concern, recognizing that her simple attempt to help her father was now affecting people's careers and reputations in ways she hadn't anticipated. The weight of that responsibility was evident in her expression as she processed the realization that technical knowledge carried moral obligations that extended far beyond individual problems. "General Hunt," Emma said quietly, her young voice cutting through the tense atmosphere with unexpected clarity, "I don't think Colonel Stone should be blamed for following the rules he was given. Mom used to say that the real problem wasn't people who followed bad procedures. It was the system that made good procedures hard to implement." The observation carried across the maintenance area with the kind of moral clarity that only children could provide, cutting through military hierarchy and institutional politics to address the fundamental issue of systemic versus individual responsibility. Hunt's expression softened slightly as she processed Emma's defense of the colonel who had earlier dismissed her contributions. "Miss Webb, that's a very mature perspective. Your mother was clearly a remarkable woman who understood both technical excellence and institutional challenges." "Yes, ma'am," Emma replied simply. She said that fixing aircraft problems was easy compared to fixing the problems that prevented people from learning how to fix aircraft problems. The recursive nature of that statement, problems, preventing solutions to problems, highlighted the institutional complexity that had allowed Angela Webb's research to be overlooked, while the flav safety issues she had predicted manifested across the fleet. Admiral Foster had been observing the entire exchange with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating complex situations rapidly. The combination of ongoing safety investigations, Pentagon oversight, and a 10-year-old girl at the center of fleet-wide technical discoveries represented exactly the kind of unprecedented situation that required careful management. "General Hunt," Foster said formally, "I need to brief you on the Defense Innovation Initiative's interest in Miss Webb's capabilities. Her demonstration of inherited technical expertise represents a resource that could have significant applications for national security research programs." The phrase "national security resource" applied to his daughter sent ice through Marcus's veins as he recognized that powerful people were beginning to view Emma not as a child who needed protection, but as an asset that could be utilized for purposes beyond his understanding or control. Hunt's response was measured, but carried undertones that suggested she understood the protective implications of Foster's interest. "Admiral Foster, Miss Webb is a 10-year-old child whose primary concern should be her education and normal development. Any research participation would require extensive evaluation of impacts on her well-being and comprehensive family consultation." "With respect, General," Dr. Garrett interjected, "exceptional capabilities carry exceptional responsibilities. Miss Webb's inherited expertise could prevent future safety crises and save countless lives. Surely those considerations outweigh conventional concerns about normal childhood development." Marcus felt his protective instincts crystallizing as he processed the implications of what these officials were discussing. They were talking about his daughter as if she were a strategic asset to be deployed rather than a child to be protected and nurtured. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the edge of a father whose patience was reaching its limit. "You're all talking about my daughter like she's some kind of military equipment. Emma is 10 years old. She needs to go to school, play with friends, and have a normal childhood. Her mother would have wanted her to have choices about her own future, not obligations determined by other people's assessment of her capabilities." The tension between family autonomy and institutional interests had finally reached its critical point, with everyone present recognizing that the next few minutes would determine whether Emma's exceptional abilities would be nurtured through supportive collaboration or exploited through institutional control. General Hunt looked around at the faces surrounding her, an admiral pushing for research recruitment, defense officials calculating strategic value, a father protecting his child's autonomy, and a 10-year-old girl whose simple act of helping had unleashed forces beyond her control. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hunt said with the authority that had defined her career, "we seem to have lost sight of something fundamental here. Miss Webb is a child who made a brilliant observation that saved lives and exposed safety issues. Our response should be gratitude and support, not institutional appropriation." She turned her attention to Emma with genuine respect. "Miss Webb, you've already contributed more to military aviation safety than most people do in entire careers. The question now is how we can honor your mother's legacy while protecting your right to be a child. What would you like to see happen?" Emma looked around at all the adults whose careers and programs were somehow connected to her morning's simple observation. The weight of their expectations was enormous, but her answer came from the same place that had guided her throughout. The day her mother's example of service balanced with family love. "I want to help keep pilots safe like Mom did," she said with quiet determination. "But I also want to stay with my dad and go to school with my friends. Could I maybe help with the training programs without having to live somewhere else or give up being a regular kid?" The simple honesty of her request highlighted the fundamental question underlying all the institutional maneuvering, whether exceptional capabilities could be utilized through collaborative support rather than institutional control, and whether a child's preferences could be honored while still addressing national security interests. As the adults processed Emma's compromise proposal, none of them noticed the unmarked surveillance van that had been monitoring their conversation from the base perimeter, or the encrypted communications being transmitted to organizations whose interest in exceptional children extended far beyond official military programs. The most dangerous phase of Emma's extraordinary day was about to begin. General Hunt's expression reflected the kind of decisive leadership that had earned her respect throughout decades of military service. "Miss Webb, that's a very reasonable request. Admiral Foster, Dr. Garrett, I think we can arrange for Emma to work with our technical teams through scheduled consultations while continuing to live with her father and attend regular school. Her insights can be incorporated into training programs without requiring her to sacrifice her normal life." Admiral Foster and Dr. Garrett exchanged glances that reflected their recognition that Emma's suggested compromise might actually represent the optimal approach to developing her capabilities while maintaining her well-being. Traditional institutional control might be less effective than collaborative partnership that honored family autonomy while providing technical support. "Miss Webb," Foster said thoughtfully, "that's a very mature suggestion. Perhaps we could arrange for you to work with our technical teams through scheduled consultations. Your insights could be incorporated into training programs without requiring you to leave your normal life." The relief that washed across Marcus's face was immediately apparent to everyone present, reflecting his recognition that powerful people were finally considering approaches that prioritized his daughter's well-being while still utilizing her exceptional capabilities. Dr. Hughes stepped forward with documents that outlined a collaborative framework he had been developing during the conversation. "General Hunt, I'd like to propose that we establish a formal consultation agreement that allows Miss Webb to review maintenance protocols and training materials on a part-time basis. Her mother's research, combined with her diagnostic insights, could be incorporated into a comprehensive safety improvement program." "That sounds reasonable," Hunt replied approvingly. "Commander Reynolds, please coordinate with the Pentagon to establish appropriate protocols for this collaboration. I want to ensure that Miss Webb's contributions are properly recognized while maintaining complete respect for her family's autonomy." Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry approached the group with diagnostic equipment, an expression of professional satisfaction. "General Hunt, if I may, we've completed secondary fuel pump diagnostics on the entire squadron based on Miss Webb's protocols. We've identified potential failures in 6 additional aircraft. That would have resulted in catastrophic problems within the next month." The implications of Wayne's report rippled through the assembled officials as they recognized that Emma's insight had prevented not just one potential disaster, but multiple aircraft losses that could have claimed pilots' lives across the coming weeks. "Miss Webb," Hunt said with genuine respect, "your diagnostic approach has potentially saved more lives than we can calculate. The Air Force owes you a debt of gratitude that extends far beyond today's discoveries." Emma looked up at the general with the same gracious dignity that had marked her interactions throughout the day. "Thank you, General Hunt. Mom always said that keeping pilots safe was the most important job on any airbase. I'm just glad her research could help." Colonel Stone, who had observed the final negotiations with growing relief and humility, approached Emma and her father with an expression that reflected both professional respect and personal gratitude. "Miss Webb," he said formally, "I owe you an apology for my earlier behavior. Your contributions today have potentially saved lives and certainly improved military aviation safety. I'm honored to have witnessed your remarkable demonstration of technical expertise." Emma looked up at the colonel with the same forgiving spirit that had guided her throughout the day. "Thank you, Colonel Stone. Mom always said that good people sometimes make mistakes when they're trying to do their jobs well. She would have liked that you care so much about keeping pilots safe." The generous forgiveness in her response seemed to highlight the fundamental decency that had guided her behavior, even when facing dismissal and ridicule from authority figures. Around them, the maintenance personnel who had witnessed her extraordinary day began the process of implementing diagnostic protocols that would honor her mother's research while protecting future generations of military pilots. Captain Rebecca Walsh stepped forward with a flight helmet in her hands, its surface bearing the insignia of the squadron that Emma had helped save. "Miss Webb, I'd like you to have this. Every time I fly, I'll remember that a brave little girl and her mother's wisdom helped keep me safe." Emma accepted the helmet with tears in her eyes, understanding that it represented more than just a gift. It was recognition from the pilots, whose lives her mother's work and her own courage had protected. Dr. Hughes closed his briefcase and looked around at the group with an expression of professional humility that had been notably absent when he first arrived. "Miss Webb, you've taught me something important today about expertise and wisdom. Sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected sources. Your mother's legacy lives on in remarkable ways." As the sun began to set over Thunderbird Air Force Base, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber, the extraordinary day that had begun with a simple fuel pump problem concluded with agreements that would reshape military maintenance protocols while protecting the child whose inherited wisdom had made those improvements possible. General Hunt smiled approvingly as she watched Emma walk hand in hand with her father toward their car, the pilot's helmet tucked proudly under her arm. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said to the assembled officials, "today we've witnessed something rare, the perfect intersection of inherited knowledge, personal courage, and institutional wisdom. Miss Webb has shown us that expertise knows no age, and that the most important discoveries sometimes come from the most unexpected places." Lieutenant Commander Reynolds nodded in agreement as she documented the day's events for her Pentagon report. "General, I think this case will become a model for how military institutions can collaborate with exceptional individuals while respecting family autonomy and personal development." As the Pentagon officials prepared to depart, Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry was already working with maintenance crews to implement Emma's diagnostic protocols across the entire base. The simple observation about secondary fuel pumps working too hard had evolved into a comprehensive safety improvement program that would protect pilots for years to come. Marcus placed his arm around his daughter's shoulders as they walked toward the parking area, pride and protectiveness mingling in his expression. "Your mom would be so proud of you today, Emma. You honored her memory and her work in the most beautiful way possible." Emma looked up at her father with eyes that reflected both the innocence of childhood and the wisdom that comes from understanding that knowledge carries responsibility. "Dad, do you think Mom knows what happened today?" "I think she knows, sweetheart, and I think she's smiling." As they drove away from Thunderbird Air Force Base, neither Emma nor Marcus noticed the unmarked surveillance van that had been monitoring the day's events, or the fact that their car was being followed at a discreet distance by people whose interest in Emma's capabilities extended far beyond official military programs. But for now, in the fading desert light, a father and daughter were simply going home after a day that had changed military aviation forever. The extraordinary had become routine, the impossible had been accomplished, and family love had proven stronger than institutional pressure to exploit rather than nurture exceptional capabilities. Emma Webb had honored her mother's legacy while protecting her own right to remain a child. And somewhere in the vast desert sky, The spirits of all the pilots whose lives had been saved by inherited wisdom and childlike courage were watching over them both. 6 months later, Emma Webb stood in the Pentagon's advanced training facility, her small hands moving confidently across a sophisticated diagnostic simulator, while a room full of experienced maintenance personnel watched in respectful silence. The Webb protocol had become standard training curriculum across all military aviation installations, and Emma had become something unprecedented, a 10-year-old consultant whose insights were transforming how the military approached aircraft. Safety. The key thing to remember, Emma explained to the assembled technicians, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had developed through months of teaching adults, is that aircraft don't lie. When something looks normal but feels wrong, there's always a reason. My mom said that trusting your instincts about what feels wrong is just as important as understanding what the instruments say is right. Master Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez, the lead instructor at the Pentagon facility, nodded approvingly as she watched Emma work with the veteran mechanics. 6 months of collaboration had proven that the child's unique combination of inherited knowledge and natural intuition could be effectively transmitted to others, creating a new generation of diagnosticians who understood the difference between theoretical maintenance and operational reality. Miss Webb, Rodriguez said as the training session concluded, your diagnostic philosophy has already prevented 12 documented aircraft failures across the fleet. The compensatory behavior analysis you developed with your mother's research has become one of our most effective troubleshooting methodologies. Emma smiled with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing her work was keeping pilots safe. The collaboration agreement General Hunt had established had proven remarkably successful. Emma spent 2 weekends each month at various military installations, teaching her mother's diagnostic approaches while maintaining her normal life as a 6th grader in Nevada. Her father, Marcus, had been promoted to Master Sergeant in recognition of his family's contributions to military aviation safety, and the Webb household had found a comfortable balance between Emma's extraordinary capabilities and her need for a normal childhood. She still did homework, played with friends, and complained about chores like any other 11-year-old. But she also carried the knowledge that her insights were protecting lives around the world. The secure phone in Rodriguez's office buzzed with an encrypted message that brought both pride and concern to the instructor's weathered features. Emma, I have some news. The International Aviation Safety Council wants to invite you to speak at their annual conference. You'd be the youngest person ever to address the assembly. Emma's eyes brightened with excitement, but her response reflected the maturity that had developed through months of balancing exceptional responsibility with personal growth. That sounds amazing, but I'd need to check with Dad first. And I'd want to make sure it doesn't interfere with the school science fair. I'm building a model of Mom's fuel efficiency modifications. The casual way Emma balanced international recognition with elementary school activities perfectly illustrated the successful compromise that had emerged from that extraordinary day at Thunderbird Air Force Base. She had been allowed to contribute her exceptional gifts without sacrificing her right to be a child. Technical Sergeant Wayne Perry appeared in the facility's doorway, his familiar smile carrying news that had brought him across the country to deliver personally. Emma, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. Remember that F-18 where you first diagnosed the fuel pump problem? She's been flying missions for 6 months without a single maintenance issue. Your diagnostic work didn't just fix one aircraft, it made her safer than she'd ever been. Emma's face lit up with the pure joy that came from knowing her mother's legacy was alive in every successful mission, every safe landing, every pilot who returned home to their family because compensatory system analysis had identified hidden problems before they became catastrophic failures. How's Colonel Stone doing? Emma asked with the generosity of spirit that had marked her forgiveness of his initial dismissal. Wayne chuckled with genuine affection. Actually thriving. After the Pentagon investigation concluded, he became one of the biggest advocates for your diagnostic protocols. He's been implementing them across his new command, and his safety record is now the best in the Air Force. Turns out that admitting you were wrong and learning from a 10-year-old girl is a pretty good career move. As the afternoon training session concluded, Emma gathered her materials with the practiced efficiency that had developed through months of traveling between military installations. Her backpack contained both advanced technical manuals and 6th grade homework, a perfect symbol of the unique life she had created. Dr. Richard Hughes appeared at the facility entrance, his expression carrying the professional respect that had replaced his initial condescension. Over the past 6 months, he had become one of Emma's most effective collaborators, translating her intuitive insights into formal training programs that could be implemented across the military aviation community. "Emma, I have something special to show you," Hughes said, opening a leather portfolio that contained official documents bearing military seals and congressional signatures. The Senate Armed Services Committee has voted to establish the Lieutenant Angela Webb Memorial Fellowship for Advanced Aerospace Diagnostics. It will provide full educational support for military children who demonstrate exceptional technical capabilities. Emma stared at the documents with tears in her eyes, understanding that her mother's name would now be permanently associated with programs that nurtured rather than exploited exceptional young minds. The fellowship would ensure that other children with inherited expertise would be supported rather than pressured, educated rather than exploited. Your mother's legacy will help protect both aircraft and the children who understand them, Hughes continued. The fellowship explicitly prohibits institutional control or residential programs. All support must respect family autonomy and normal childhood development. As Emma prepared to return home to Nevada, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with a simple observation about fuel pump behavior. Her mother's research had finally found its proper place in military aviation protocols. Systemic maintenance problems had been identified and corrected, and a new generation of diagnosticians was learning to listen when aircraft tried to communicate their distress. The unmarked surveillance van that had followed their family for months had finally disappeared, its occupants apparently convinced that Emma's contributions would remain within official channels rather than being available for exploitation by unauthorized interests. The protection provided by General Hunt's oversight and congressional attention had proven more powerful than institutional pressure to control rather than collaborate. Marcus appeared at the facility entrance with car keys and a father's proud smile, ready to drive his daughter home to a life that balanced extraordinary contribution with ordinary childhood pleasures. "Ready to go home, sweetheart? You have a math test tomorrow, and Mrs. Patterson said the school science fair projects are due next week." Emma nodded eagerly, understanding that her greatest achievement wasn't solving aircraft maintenance problems or briefing Pentagon officials. It was finding a way to honor her mother's legacy while protecting her own right to grow up surrounded by family love and normal childhood experiences. As they drove away from the Pentagon facility, Emma looked out at the vast sky that her mother had dedicated her life to making safer. Somewhere in that endless blue, pilots were flying aircraft protected by diagnostic protocols that bore her family's name, their safety ensured by inherited wisdom passed from mother to daughter and shared with a grateful nation. "Dad," Emma said as they headed toward the airport, "do you think Mom would be proud of what we've accomplished?" Marcus smiled as he considered everything that had grown from that morning's simple observation about secondary fuel pumps. Lives saved, careers transformed, institutional systems improved, and a family's love proving stronger than forces that sought to exploit rather than nurture exceptional gifts. "I think she'd be proud that you found a way to change the world while still being her little girl," he replied. And I think she'd be amazed that her research is finally getting the recognition it deserved. As their plane lifted off into the Nevada sunset, neither Emma nor Marcus knew that their story had inspired legislation protecting exceptional children from institutional exploitation, or that the web protocols would eventually be adopted by civilian aviation authorities worldwide, saving countless lives far beyond military installations. But they did know that they had honored Angela Webb's memory in the most perfect way possible, by ensuring that her brilliant research would protect pilots for generations to come, while proving that exceptional abilities could be nurtured through love and collaboration rather than controlled through institutional pressure. In the cargo hold below them, Emma's pilot helmet rested safely in its case, a symbol of the extraordinary day when a 10-year-old girl's whispered observation had changed military aviation forever. And in the vast desert sky ahead, the lights of Thunderbird Air Force Base twinkled like stars, marking the place where inherited wisdom had triumphed over institutional pride, where family love had proven stronger than bureaucratic control, and where a mother's legacy lived on in her daughter's courage to speak truth to power. The story of Emma Webb had become legend, not because a child had solved an impossible problem, but because she had shown the world that expertise knows no age, wisdom recognizes no rank, and sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected voices. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Emma pulled out her homework and began working on math problems with the same focused attention she brought to aircraft diagnostics. She was, after all, still an 11-year-old girl who had passed 6th grade, even if she had also revolutionized military aviation safety and established protocols that would protect pilots for decades to come. The extraordinary had become ordinary, the impossible had been accomplished, and somewhere in the endless sky, Lieutenant Angela Webb's spirit watched over her daughter with infinite pride, knowing that her life's work would live on through the child who had inherited not just her technical brilliance, but her unwavering commitment to keeping those who fly safe in the vast and unforgiving sky. And in training facilities around the world, a new generation of maintenance personnel was learning to listen when aircraft whispered their secrets, understanding that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from complex instruments or expensive consultants, but from the simple wisdom of a mother who had taught her daughter that machines, like people, will tell you what's wrong if you just know how to listen. The Webb legacy was secure, protected by love, nurtured by collaboration, and honored by a grateful nation that had learned the difference between exploiting exceptional gifts and celebrating them. Emma Webb had changed the world while remaining exactly what she had always been, her mother's daughter, her father's pride, and a remarkable young woman whose greatest achievement was proving that extraordinary capabilities and ordinary childhood dreams could coexist in perfect harmony. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.